Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of Two Cooks Talking. I am your host, Long Nguyen. I am not an expert on food or cooking. I'm an expert on food, probably, but not cooking. But I do, like I said, enjoy food. With me is my co host, executive chef Michael Weller, who is an expert on food
Well,
and cooking.
thanks. I certainly enjoy food and eating food primarily. So
Okay, so for this episode, we decided to kind of dive into correcting cooking mistakes. And we just have a variety of topics we want to cover, just things that people do while cooking, to kind of course correct them as well as prevent those mistakes from happening in the first place. For this part, I'll mostly be handing it off to Mike just because he is more of the expert on that. I try my best to prevent things from happening, but I'm not. I'm certainly not great at course correcting. I do have a few things up my sleeve. So, Mike, if you want to kick it off.
well, I think one of the biggest things on as far as fixing mistakes is obviously not having them to begin with. I'm constantly reminded of seasoning and one of the differences between seasoning I've done professionally and what happens in a home is typically if you read a normal recipe, all of the seasoning gets added at one time, which is okay if you're exactly right that one time. But I'm not that good. I'll tell you right now, I'm not that good. I've worked with master chefs who perhaps are that good. I'm nowhere near that good. I like seasoning gradually and tasting constantly. The classic saying is never trust a skinny chef. I don't know. I've never been at risk of that. But one of the reasons is that a good chef tastes constantly. So if you're going to be seasoning something, there's a real danger to over salting if you put in all of the salt at one time. But if you're adding a little bit of salt gradually throughout the cooking, that danger is certainly lessened.
Yeah. Yeah, we actually covered that a little bit last week, where salting throughout the process not only prevents you from oversalting, but helps integrate it a little bit more, so that way you're not just you know tasting the finishing salt, so to speak. You're tasting the salt that's kind of the seasoning that's been added throughout the dish.
I think once a dish is over salted, you really have some really limited options.
Okay.
First of all, you can add more of the other food. Not always available, but if you were making a dish that serves four and you oversalted it and you add enough ingredients to make it serve eight, but don't add any more salt,
Mm.
sometimes that will correct things. But there isn't a way that I know of in my cooking experience to unsalt things or uncook things.
Right.
So increasing the quantity of the other ingredients can help. I think we mentioned last week the possibility of adding sweetness
Right. Just to balance it out a
just
little
to
bit.
help balance
Yeah.
it out depending on the dish. Um, I can't honestly vouch for the efficacy of this, but in some things like soups, it may be possible to add quantities of raw potatoes and cook them and then remove those potatoes
Interesting.
in the hope that the potatoes kind of suck up some of the salt and then you discard the potatoes
Right.
and keep the rest of the soup. Um, but yeah, seasoning is something that should be done judiciously.
Okay. Now, kind of similarly, overspicing foods can be a problem where some people just um, get a little heavy-handed with the spice. I can do this. I do this sometimes, which I don't mind too much. But it does happen, and I know in my case that's especially where sweetness comes in for me because I feel like that really balances out. Especially like I did this not too long ago with some beef that I was cooking that I overspiced, so I added a little brown sugar just to mellow that out, and it worked wonders. And it actually created another layer for me through the cooking.
This is kind of near and dear. One of the actually the first time I ever cooked on my own and for myself, I was 13 years old, and as part of kind of a coming of age thing, I was allowed to stay at home. I went shopping for my own meal. I bought ground beef and macaroni and cheese and Tabasco sauce, and I made a chili mac dish on my own. Nobody else in the house, and I emptied the whole bottle of Tabasco into the dish. but there was no way I was going to tell anyone that it wasn't perfect. So I ate the whole thing anyway. Um, there are lots of tricks I wish I had known then. Sugar being an excellent one, of
Yeah.
course. Other than sugar and balancing things that way, the quantity trick that I mentioned with salt also works with spice.
Right.
Buy another box of macaroni and cheese and don't add any more Tabasco. That kind of thing can work. But again, I think if you're adding a little bit of spice at the beginning and allowing the spice to build with the food and building flavors together, you're less likely to make a dramatic mistake when you're adding a
Right.
portion at a time.
Right. And we know that I don't know anything about this really, but we know that dairy is sometimes complements to spice to kind of neutralize it because capsaicin is a fat
Fat
soluble
soluble.
chemical. Does that have any effect? I know this things like spicy queso, so I don't know if adding dairy helps at all.
I don't know that adding dairy to a dish will help you
Okay.
much as sugar will.
Okay.
And there is always a risk because capsaicin is fat soluble.
Hmm.
The other thing you're doing when you introduce fat into a spicy dish is spreading the capsaicin around your
Right.
mouth.
Okay.
So there is that danger as well.
Okay. Now we can dive right into a little more technique-based problems. I know that we were talking just a little bit before we jumped on the microphones that, for instance, having lumpy gravy.
Lumpy gravy. We're heading into kind of Thanksgiving holiday season.
Mm.
One of the great traditions around Thanksgiving, at least growing up, was the delicious gravy. And one of the times throughout the year that just about any family makes their own gravy happens at Thanksgiving, where you have all
Mhm.
those wonderful drippings from the turkey, and you lift the turkey out of the pan and let it rest, and you make a gravy with the juices and the fat that's run off, and typically these gravies, these pan sauces, are, I mean, they have a huge background in traditional French cooking. Pan sauces are a cornerstone of classic cuisine. It's a really great technique. One problem is they are almost inevitably thickened with a starch, either a flour and butter mixture called a roux or a slurry made with a cornstarch and a liquid. Gets added to the liquid in the pan and whisked together.
Mm.
It really works. It thickens up the liquid, makes a beautiful gravy. It's one of everyone's favorite parts of Thanksgiving. The drawback happens when you don't dissolve all of the flour or all of the cornstarch and you get lumps.
Mm.
Lumpy gravy is just it's almost a classic cook insult. Your gravy's lumpy, right? And it's not a end of the dish kind of fault, but it's something that the 3-year-old at the table can point at you and laugh at. So, but luckily there's a lot of really easy solutions to it, depending on the number and prevalence and size of the lumps in the gravy. You can put gravy in a blender.
Oh,
There's nothing to stop you from blending those lumps out.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Be careful when you're adding a hot liquid to a blender. You want to let the hot gases escape so they don't build up pressure. And after you puree everything in the gravy, you do need to put it back in a pan and cook it out. The lumps are lumps of flour, and in the middle is flour that hasn't been cooked. Uncooked flour tastes like flour and it's
Right.
a bad flavor in a sauce. So once you break everything up by blending it, you then need to cook it.
Okay.
You can strain it. Get a fine mesh sieve and run your gravy through the sieve, and it'll come out smooth. It's one of the reasons in classic French cuisine everything is passed through a strainer at just or a chinois at just about every stage of the cooking is to remove the lumps and leave behind a satin smooth sauce. So
Mm.
those are two kind of effective techniques to getting rid of lumpy gravy.
Okay.
And the third one is just don't invite such picky people to your house.
I think you kind of briefly touched on the next one with by you're talking about adding starches to gravies to help thicken it up, but having sauces that split. So,
Sauces, depends on the sauce. Oftentimes we're adding a dairy product to a sauce,
right.
right? I am part of the mutant section of the world, the genetically altered people who can digest lactose.
Okay, I'm a mutant of a mutant at being an Asian that can digest lactose
You're a
freely.
tiny fraction of the population. I love adding dairy. Dairy smooths out sauces, cream, beautiful. One of the problems is if you add dairy to a hot sauce, you have to be very careful about the temperature and about the fat content. Skim milk is probably the most dangerous thing you can add to a hot sauce because skim milk has zero fat, is really high in proteins. When the proteins hit the hot liquid, they coagulate. They come together and jumble and clump up. That's one of the ways a sauce can split. If you do the same thing with sour cream, oftentimes the same thing will happen. You almost never split a sauce when you add heavy cream. Now, I'm not your doctor. I'm not trying to be a medical advisor here, but the fact is, heavy cream doesn't split. There's enough fat in there to shield and buffer the proteins from the heat and prevent them from coming together. So even if the heat does denature them, the proteins can't form large enough groups to affect your sauce.
Okay.
So if you have to add a lower fat dairy to a sauce, the idea is to do it slowly, to do it at lower heat, to never bring the heat up to boiling because your sauce is likely to split.
Okay. Um, Stepping back just a second, as an informational bit for the listeners, is heavy whipping cream the same as heavy cream?
Heavy whipping cream, heavy cream, manufacturing cream, all are different titles for different percentages of fat in your cream.
Got it.
We're effectively looking at fat contents that approach 40%.
Mhm.
There's a reason it's yummy. It's got a lot of fat in
Yeah.
it. And typically, in the United States, our heavy creams are slightly less heavy in fat than European heavy creams. Just a matter
Go
of
figure.
technique and sources.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're so half and half is typically the next step down on the dairy rung in fat content, and then whole milk
Hmm.
is typically how it goes.
But heavy whipping cream is pretty interchangeable with
With
heavy cream.
or what in the restaurant industry is called manufacturing cream.
Okay.
They're pretty interchangeable terms.
Okay. Because like a lot of recipes call for heavy cream. Store shelves don't really have things that say just heavy cream, it's heavy whipping cream. So
Right.
just make sure everyone knows that it is an interchangeable ingredient.
If there's ever any doubt, check the back of the label and look for the percentage of fat.
Okay.
And you're looking for 36 to 40% there.
Okay. It's good to know. Okay. I'm sorry if I interrupted you. I don't know if you had
Go,
any more
man.
about splitting sauces or anything.
There's also sauces that split. Things like mayonnaises and hollandaise
Hmm.
sauces tend to split, and those are pretty intricate and detailed sauces, and
Hmm.
and they tend to have specific ways of correcting them. There is a general rule that applies to sauces. You never add good into bad. So if you have a pot full of sauce that has split,
Hmm.
you don't want to add good into that.
Hmm.
You always want to add bad into good. So get a small bit of a mayonnaise that hasn't broken,
Hmm.
a good mayonnaise, and slowly add the bad into the good.
Oh, interesting.
Just and that works. You can a small amount of good sauce can gradually fix the bad sauce.
Hmm.
But a small amount of good sauce dumped into a large amount of bad loses, and you just get more bad. So, just the general technique is always add the bad into the good.
Okay.
So, and stop things as quickly as possible. These reactions happen because different molecules are close to similar molecules, right?
Hmm.
Fats run into fats and get together, more fats get added. It doesn't happen instantly. So as you notice a sauce breaking, it typically happens around the edges of a pot. Get it off the heat. Maybe get it off the heat and put it in a sink full of ice water.
Hmm.
If nothing else, chuck in a couple ice cubes. Bring the temperature down and stop things early. You're less likely to have a problem you can't fix.
Okay. Cool. Are there any other techniques that you would call out for that can go wrong that you would want to correct?
Oh, the things that can go wrong in the kitchen. There's a reason. I have some food science background. There's a reason I tend to be superstitious in the kitchen, and that's because things go wrong constantly
Right.
in the kitchen. There are so many different variables in so much interplay and affecting one another that I don't think we could do enough podcasts to cover every eventuality.
I have a friend who's a chef that has been cooking for quite some time now, and he was whipping up a pizza just really quickly, just cut off the tip of his thumb, just on a whim. He says he's done it. He's cut up these bell peppers thousands of times, but he just wasn't paying attention that one time. So,
There's kind of amongst people who've spent a long time in the kitchen, there are mistakes that are so common that we just nod. You, so whenever you have a like a saute pan that you're cooking on top of the stove, and you take the food and you put it in the oven to finish cooking, whenever you take that pan out of the oven, it's a danger because it looks just like a frying pan,
yeah,
and you're going to grab it and you're going to burn yourself because the handle's at 350 degrees. And that happens so frequently. This burn, typically because pots are designed with a little hole in the handle so you can hang them on a hook.
right.
So you get a burn that has this little circle in the middle where you're not burned because of that hole. Such a classic burn. People look at each other and laugh because you know exactly how you got that. There's a cut on your index finger that happens when you allow that finger to kind of wander forward while you're chopping
Yeah.
things. There's a very distinctive kind of half moon cut, and I've cooked for 40 years, and I had a cut like that last year. It just happens. It's not, and you look and you laugh because you've been there and you've done that.
Yeah.
There is it. It doesn't entirely help with the cuts and the burns and the pain, but there is a camaraderie to it.
Yeah.
We've all been in kitchens and these things happen.
Since we kind of delve into the realm of accidents, let's talk a little bit about accidents.
Sure.
They happen in the kitchen. One thing about a hot pan, sometimes they catch on fire. One thing I learned in grade school, which apparently when I watch some cooking shows, they never learned in grade school, is you don't put a pan on fire underwater.
Yeah. So the reason why when you have a campfire, you put water over the campfire is you're trying to seal it off from oxygen. Oxygen is necessary. It's the fuel of the fire. Oxygen is required to have fire. And if you put water over the burning thing, then oxygen can't get to it and the fire goes out. The problem in a kitchen is almost inevitably there's a lot of heat and there's a good amount of oil. So water is bad for any number of reasons. It can move the fire to a larger area because the grease floats on the water as the water spreads out.
Yeah.
The water can hit the really hot heat and turn into steam. As the water turns into steam, it carries tiny impurities into the air. The air is really hot, and these little tiny impurities in the water get ignited by the heat,
Yeah.
and the fire explodes. You get
Yeah.
fire. You get actual fireballs. I've seen any number of times in the kitchen. So it's good to remember the principle and not the specific.
Yeah.
So the idea with a fire in the kitchen is deny it oxygen,
Smother it.
smother it,
Yeah.
choke it out, to use a terminology from your life.
Yeah.
So far more effective than water is baking soda. Baking soda won't burn. Baking soda in a layer over fire will put out a grease fire. It's a great technique. Sometimes something as simple as putting a lid on it,
Right. As long as you don't lift the lid too soon.
and then leave it for a day.
Yeah.
Never come back to it until
Yeah.
it's cooled all the way down. Exactly. Good point. In restaurants, you never want to see what happens at a restaurant. If a fire happens in a restaurant, they're all equipped now with fire suppression systems that dump a huge layer of highly effective foam over the top of everything.
Oh, wow.
And the fire goes out instantly.
Yeah.
And then you spend a day and a half cleaning up.
Yeah.
But it works because, again, it suffocates the fire.
Okay. Sticking with the theme of fire, burns. They happen in the kitchen. You just mentioned them. They happen all the time. Like I don't know anybody that's ever tried cooking that hasn't burned themselves. So,
And unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily stop.
mm,
Um, it's a myth. I will tell you now, my fellow chefs may turn on me. Chefs do not have asbestos fingers. We are not immune to pain. I'm not going to go so far as to say we're not superhuman, but we're not immune to pain. We're not immune to heat,
yeah,
right? Burns happen in the kitchen, and the first and foremost rule with a burn is stop the cooking.
hmm,
So I mentioned earlier, when you see the sauce breaking, take it off the heat.
right,
When you get a burn, take it off the heat. The best, most recommended first aid technique for a burn is cool running water.
right.
Under a faucet, cool running water. Ice can actually damage you. If you put an ice pack against your skin, you may stop the heat and then physically damage yourself with the cold. So cool running water, constantly replaced over and over, will stop the cooking, and that's one of the high priorities of things.
So not the old wives' tale of putting butter on it or soy sauce or
The number of there are more recipes for burns in the kitchen than for any other thing. I have seen more um, uh, techniques used on burns.
yeah,
Cool running water,
yeah,
cool running water. I have herbal burn remedies from nations around the world. I have some of them in my cabinet next to my stove.
mm,
Once the burn has stopped and the damage is no longer happening, pick the route that you feel comfortable in your heart with. But when it's happening, stop the cooking. Get it under cool running water. After that, blisters. If it goes past a first degree burn and turns into a second degree burn, and you get a blister, um, first thing to remember is that blister is a wonderful thing. Your body is doing the best possible thing for the burn. It's creating a completely sterile environment and flooding that burned area with completely sterile saline solution,
mm,
all on its own. Don't pop the blister. I was 12 years old and a boy at
yeah,
one point in my life, and I used to pop blisters and see how far I could make them squirt. Assuming that you've advanced beyond that, leave the blister in place. It's doing really good things for your burn.
yeah. Um, and as far as other accents go, I mean, cutting I think is pretty obvious. You do whatever normal first aid you would normally do for a cut, right?
Yeah, and all of these. Look, I know some things about nutrition,
Hmm,
and I will mention them as good or bad habits.
hmm,
I know some things about first aid, and I'll mention good or bad routes to take. But when in any kind of doubt at all,
hmm.
see a doctor.
Yeah.
I'm a cook. I don't put people back together. And I have very good friends who are doctors and emergency room nurses, and they've seen all this stuff. Um, any burn that goes beyond a blister, any large scale blister, go to a doctor.
Mm,
Any cut that doesn't stop with direct pressure, go to a doctor.
mm.
Anytime you're concerned at all, go to a doctor. It's really important. And I'll cook you a recovery meal, but I'm not here to advise you in the actual accident
Yeah.
time. There's minor concerns with chemicals. There's a lot of heavy duty chemicals that used in cleanup. It's just really important to store those away from any kind of food prep area, obviously.
Yeah.
Slips and falls. The kitchen tends to get wet. The kitchen can get greasy. I I don't think even at home I ever cook barefoot. It's just I wear pants and shoes
Yeah.
because it's just safer that way. But
Is that why chefs wear those awesome rubber shoes all the time?
chefs wear awesome shoes all the time because gravity works,
Yeah.
right? And grease falls and flame falls and knives fall, and that's where your feet live.
Mm.
And it's a profession that involves being on your feet for 70 hours a week. You have to take care of the wheels underneath you, so
Mm.
it's important.
Yeah. Um, As far as kind of, so sometimes accidents will happen, sometimes mistakes will happen. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but just briefly touch on resetting. So if the pan catches on fire, you usually just once you put it out, do you scrub it out and then start over, or do you just grab a new pan at that point? Or I don't know if there's a residual flavor from the.
Um, with almost no exception, there's no such thing as golden black, right?
Mm,
Burns don't taste good.
right,
Burned food doesn't taste good.
right.
Um, as much as it bothers me to get rid of the flavor that develops in a pan as you're cooking, if you
Mm,
burn something, start fresh.
mm,
It, it's especially troubling to have made one mistake and then let that mistake affect your second attempt.
mm.
So I like the starting fresh idea.
Yeah,
And you know what? I'm cheap. I don't like wasting food. I hate throwing good food out.
right.
But don't waste food by trying to fix it.
Yeah,
There's a point where you just draw the line, suck it up, say you blew it, get rid of it, and start fresh.
yeah.
There is salt that can't be overcome. There is spice that's just too much. There's a sauce that's just too split. Don't be afraid to say, let's try that again.
As far as cuts go, sometimes you might get a little blood on like a cutting board or something like that. I don't know, first thing is you probably flip it over, cover your cut up, and then get back to work if you're on a professional line, right?
Actually, no.
No?
One of the mistakes that are made as far as safety and sanitation is flipping the board does not give you a clean surface.
Hmm.
So a board that gets bled on
Hmm.
by anything, including the chef himself,
Hmm.
gets washed and replaced.
Okay.
Um, and in general, it's just pretty common sense. Anything you bleed on gets scrubbed down.
Right.
Um,
Do you
I
just go with soap and water, or do you use a bleach?
I
Or
love soap and water.
mm,
Just about any time I'm cooking with chicken, I add a dilute bleach
mm,
to begin with, a really heavily diluted bleach and water mix that I begin with, and follow that up with soap and water, and follow that up with a rinse.
mm,
My computer room
mhm.
is a mess, but safety and sanitation rules and guidelines in the kitchen are important, and they're things I follow.
Okay, cool. Well, I think that does it for episode 5 of Two Cooks Talking. We do have a Facebook like page now. It's facebook.com slash Two Cooks Talking. That's the number two. You can also subscribe to our podcast at twocookstalking.podbean.com. You can email us at twocookstalking@gmail.com. All those twos are with the number two. Um, and I think that covers the little bit of plugs. So I've been your host, Long Nguyen,
I'm Michael Weller.
and we'll talk to you next time.